Let's now shift gears and take a look at the environment and the topic of climate change and how that's having an impact on the debt conversation. I'd like now to cross it over to Joanne Manda from United Nations Development Program. She is a Senior SDG Investment Advisor in UNDP, Africa Finance Sector Hub, supporting countries undertaking the SDG investor mapping exercises and developing partnerships to advance SDG-aligned investments across the continent. Joan, just the other day, we saw the IPCC report, which put code red for humanity in climate change, talking about humanity's damaging impact on the climate as being a state of fact, and really a call to action to address this immediately. So we're seeing intensified loud calls for a green recovery post the pandemic. For Africa, these issues are in addition to already the most basic ones that we have in provision of education, dealing with potential effects of lost years of education, declining investments in social sectors, and also just being one of the biggest victims of the climate emergency. So how do we balance out this equation, especially for those that feel that the environment or climate change is not really a priority for Africa? We have lots of other pressing economic and social factors affecting the continent and other urgent needs as well. From a financing perspective, how do we balance out this equation?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Maya, a huge thank you to Afrodite for this incredible conference. I think an opportunity to have an African conversation around these issues cannot be underscored enough. And so it's a real pleasure for me to be here. I am Joanne Manda and I work for UNDP. I'm based in Pretoria in the Africa Finance Sector Hub, which is a new unit that's looking at exactly what you've just asked me, Maya. How do we help governments to balance the priorities that they have and to look at financing in a holistic manner in order to really know where to prioritize the best bang for your buck? And from a climate change perspective, I mean, the IPCC's sixth assessment report does not come as a surprise. I think there has been a great sense for a number of years now that we are close to a climate emergency. And this has been an emergency that's been trickling up in people's consciences. And then COVID hit, and in some ways underlined that emergency. It not just took attention away from it, but really helped us to understand the interconnectedness of our economies and how a small ripple in one sector actually has implications for the whole economy. This is an argument that climate scientists have been saying for years, that climate change is multi-sectoral and it's cross-cutting. And similar to the way the COVID pandemic has now really shown the socioeconomic impact, and recognizing that actually as governments, we have to address this holistically. We can't drop the climate agenda. We have to think about COVID and COVID recovery with the understanding that climate shocks are still a huge factor to our overall sustainability. With that in mind, I think the African negotiators are very clear, certainly going towards COP26, which is happening in November in Glasgow this year, wanting to go into that conversation with a really strong push for Africa to be at the center of the climate change discussion, climate change negotiation. Africa is about 4% of global emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and yet we suffer the brunt of the impacts of climate change. And our economies already, as others, other co-panelists have highlighted, are already under a lot of strain. There's a very limited fiscal space, and we need to start thinking about our overall economic development from a clear understanding that sustainability must be core. And that is whether you're looking at debt sustainability or climate sustainability. I think the issues are very, very closely interlinked and related. And here's what's interesting. I think it's really important that we recognize that a recent UN environment report has pointed out that even with COVID, the cost of adaptation, annual cost for adaptation in a lot of LDCs will rise to over $300 billion by 2030, close to 500 billion by 2050. And African governments are already spending 2 to 9% of their GDP on adaptation responses. So I guess what I'm trying to say really is that you can't, in a world where you're trying to juggle a lot of priorities, the climate and the economic cannot be separated and must be addressed at the same time. And so what does this mean in terms of looking forward and in the context of this conference, and especially around the issues around debt and debt sustainability that countries are having to think about? If we are going with the understanding that the efforts for COVID recovery, looking at socioeconomic recovery, and looking at green recovery concurrently, we need to start having conversations that are talking about investments that go beyond the fundamentals, but looking at ESG investment in a broader sense, recognizing that we can't leave the socioeconomic and the environment as separate. We've got to bring that all together. And the ESG community has understood this and is a growing area of work for many of us. And certainly in UNDP, within our finance sector hub, we're starting to look at how we can have conversations with private sector to look at financing from a sustainability perspective and making sure that we are putting money where we will get maximum return. I liked what Alan said earlier. Why should we be taking on debt that does not benefit us? And I think one of the areas around the climate finance story where we've seen a rise in green and thematic bonds is about using debt instruments in a way that will actually benefit the environment, benefit economies and societies. And so we've seen a rise in these green bonds, but it's not enough. There's a lot more that can be done while managing. When we're talking about debt, you've got to manage the supply and the demand side. And so how do we manage our national public financial systems in a way that actually allows us to be efficient and effective in our allocation of resources so that we are investing with the long term in mind? There's a lot of pressure, of course, with the COVID recovery to think short term, but I think it's really important going forward to try and ensure that any kind of recovery efforts still maintain a really strong view on long-term sustainability. And this is in line with investments in long-term strategies for climate change, but also long-term debt management, right? And how do we make sure that the two are being kept in mind, even as we are thinking about recovery in the immediate term? In terms of the climate finance story, I think African countries and certainly the group of negotiators are very, very concerned about ensuring that the COP does ensure that developed countries continue to strengthen their commitment and recognizing and not shifting their responsibilities, the climate responsibilities, to developing economies, but to continue the commitment towards climate, long-term green growth, actually, and low emissions development. And so trying to make sure that, we don't allow the urgency of the immediate to derail the long-term perspective. I think it's also important, from the perspective of recognizing that, public-private partnerships are going to have to be the way to go going forward, and understanding that there's need to really leverage the private sector innovation. Alan was talking about how the youth can come into play. How do we make sure that some of the tax, incentives that are going into play are not just for corporates and for the formal market, but going all the way down and recognizing that adaptation starts at the grassroots. I think it was Crystal who was talking about looking at debt at a household level as well, and the same applies with adaptation. It starts, all the way down to the household level. So having to keep those sorts of parameters in mind as well. And I think that's it's a complicated and challenging terrain, but certainly it's something that governments have to continue to grapple with in the context of debt sustainability, climate related recovery, and long-term sustainability as a whole. Maybe I'll stop there because I'm recognizing our time is really moving fast.
Mm-hmm. All right, we have about 15 minutes left, but then I just want you to, in 2 minutes, just summarize for us what it really means for us to Africanize the green recovery process. Because just the other day, I was doing a story taking a look at the fact that by 2030, all car manufacturers are going to go green. But if we look at the African landscape, how prepared are we to be able to create that ecosystem where we have a green transport, industry, which is something that we're still trying to grow. And it feels like we're lagging behind the world when it comes to catching up with, moving into this green economy space. So how do we Africanize the green economy space, keeping in mind as well that 70% of our economy is actually informal? How do we get that down to the grassroots level?
I think that's a really good question, and I think we mustn't underplay what Africa is already doing in the green space. I think there's a lot of, Pan-African initiatives, the African Renewable Energy Initiative, for example, that, is taking, growing to scale and moving at pace. So there are a myriads of, opportunities for investing in green on the African continent. We have a vast, natural resources, aside from the sun itself, but, hydropower and geothermal across the continent that we could really be tapping into. I think, and this is something that also I think Alan also alluded to, holding our governments to account, having these conversations about the way in which we are utilizing our resources with the future in mind. And again, I think I come back to this point about long-term vision for the African continent. We have a growing leadership that's beginning to appreciate and understand this. And when you say Africanizing green recovery, I think it starts from the individual, recognizing that, we have to put in this investment with the future in mind. And sustainability is at the core of that. And as Africans, we've been adapting for years, and we have that capacity within us, right from the grassroots level and all the way throughout our institutions. It is a matter of policy and creating those enabling environments, enabling investments to come into play. And I think for me, certainly the work that's happening with the African Renewable Energy Initiative takes us a long way into that. With the COVID recovery and the COVID pandemic, we're beginning to see as African that it's, digital connectivity is crucial and it's key. I remember we also mentioned how, the impact of shutting down Twitter and so on. We have a dynamic informal sector that is moving in this direction anyway. And it's about galvanizing that, it's about capturing that inherent adaptability, that inherent innovation that we're already seeing on the ground. Thank you.
To read and sign the Harare Declaration, go to www.afrodat.org/initiatives. Click on Afrodat Conference on Data and Development, and then read more. And finally, the outcome statement.